Most people think confusion is a sign that something has gone wrong. They treat it like a warning light that says, "Stop, you are failing, you are not cut out for this subject." That idea does not come from careful observation, it comes from training. In school, the goal is usually to produce answers quickly. The student who hesitates is marked down. The student who feels unsure is told to study more, memorize harder, or ask for the right explanation. Over time, confusion becomes associated with weakness. But notice something simple. Confusion only appears when you are paying attention. If you are not thinking, you are not confused. A parrot repeating sounds is never confused. A person reciting words they memorized last night is rarely confused either. Confusion shows up only when your mind tries to use what it knows and finds that it does not work. That already tells us something important. Confusion is not the absence of thinking. It is the failure of a particular way of thinking. There is another mistake hidden in the usual attitude. People imagine that understanding is a smooth feeling, like sliding across ice. If it feels rough, they assume it must be wrong. But smoothness can come from repetition, not understanding. You can repeat a sentence so many times that it feels natural, even if you cannot use it for anything. That feeling is familiarity, not comprehension. So the common picture is backwards. Feeling confident is not evidence that you understand. Feeling confused is not evidence that you do not. Confusion is what happens when your mind stops pretending. It is the moment when borrowed ideas fall apart under their own weight. That moment is uncomfortable, but it is also precise. It marks the exact place where real understanding has to begin. Once confusion appears, most people try to escape it as fast as possible. They look for a definition, a formula, or someone confident enough to sound convincing. This reaction feels reasonable, but it hides a problem. When you rush to remove confusion, you often replace it with words instead of understanding. The discomfort goes away, but nothing solid has been built. To see this clearly, focus on what actually happens in your mind. Before confusion, you carry an expectation. You believe that if you think in a certain way, the result should follow. Then something breaks. The result does not follow. At that instant, you cannot predict what will happen next. That loss of prediction is confusion. It is not vague. It is very specific. It happens at a precise point, tied to a precise assumption. This is why confusion is useful. It points directly to the assumption that failed. If you ignore it, you lose that information. If you cover it with a memorized explanation, you bury the only clue you had about where your thinking was wrong or incomplete. Real progress depends on noticing exactly which expectation collapsed, not on restoring comfort. This also explains why saying the name of something feels satisfying but does very little. A name gives you a handle, not control. If you say, "This happens because of X," but you cannot tell me what would change if X was slightly different, then nothing has been learned. You have labeled the confusion, not resolved it. Understanding only shows itself when you can follow behavior step by step and see how changes lead to different outcomes. When confusion is treated this way, it becomes an instrument. You slow down. You narrow the question. You stop asking for answers and start asking what must be true for your expectation to have failed. That process is quiet and often frustrating. It does not feel clever, but it is honest. If this way of thinking makes sense to you, pause for a moment and write in the comments what confusion you are currently avoiding or rushing past. Not a topic name. Describe the exact point where your understanding stops working. And if you want more careful, no-nonsense thinking like this, subscribe so we can continue examining how understanding actually forms, step by step, without shortcuts. If you stay with confusion instead of escaping it, something subtle begins to happen. Your thinking slows down, not because you are tired, but because fast answers are no longer available. This slowing is important. When answers come too quickly, they arrive before you have checked whether the question makes sense. Confusion removes that option. It forces you to look carefully at what you are assuming without noticing. Consider what it means to understand something in a practical sense. It does not mean being able to say the right words. It means being able to say what will happen next under slightly different conditions. If you push here instead of there, if this number is larger instead of smaller, if one part is removed or changed, what follows? The moment you cannot answer those questions, you have reached the edge of your understanding. That edge is confusion. At this edge, many people feel stuck. They say, "I don't get it," and stop. But that statement hides an important detail. You always don't get it in a specific way. There is something you expected to happen that did not. There is some step that no longer follows. If you can locate that exact step, confusion becomes sharp instead of blurry. A sharp confusion can be worked with. A blurry one cannot. This is also where discipline matters. It is tempting to jump to explanations that sound deep but explain nothing. Words like complex, emergent, or counterintuitive can end a discussion without resolving it. They feel like conclusions, but they are often just signals that thinking stopped. A disciplined approach asks a different question. What can I actually check right now? What small change can I imagine and follow carefully? Progress often comes from reducing the problem, not expanding it. You take a situation that feels overwhelming and strip it down until only one moving part remains. Then you watch that part closely. You ask what it does, not what it is called. You see where your expectations line up with what happens and where they do not. Each mismatch produces a small, manageable confusion. That is the kind that leads somewhere. It is important to say this clearly. Confusion does not guarantee success. Many confusions lead to dead ends. You can work carefully and still find that your idea was wrong or incomplete. That is not failure, that is information. Each failed attempt narrows the space of possibilities. You now know one more way the world does not behave. In this sense, confusion is not a problem to solve once and eliminate forever. It is a signal you learn to read. It tells you where your thinking touches reality and where it floats above it. Used properly, it keeps you honest. It prevents you from mistaking familiarity for knowledge. And it reminds you that understanding is not a possession you collect, but an activity you perform again and again at the exact points where things stop making sense. As you work this way, another distinction becomes clear, one that is easy to miss if you move too fast. There is a difference between not knowing and pretending to know. Not knowing is quiet. It leaves room for questions. Pretending to know is loud. It fills the space with explanations that cannot be tested. Confusion belongs to the first state, not the second. When people avoid confusion, they often replace it with certainty borrowed from somewhere else. A book, a teacher, a respected authority. This can be useful at times, but it carries a risk. Borrowed certainty can sit in your mind without ever being checked. As long as nothing challenges it, it feels solid. But the solidity is an illusion. The moment you try to use it, especially in a new situation, it collapses. That collapse is confusion returning, usually in a more frustrating form. A person who respects confusion learns to spot this earlier. They notice when an explanation works only in the narrow case where it was taught. They notice when they cannot extend it even slightly without getting lost. These moments are not embarrassing. They are informative. They show where understanding has stopped growing and where it must be rebuilt from simpler pieces. This rebuilding does not start with grand questions. It starts with modest ones. What exactly did I expect to happen here? Which step felt obvious but now no longer does? If I freeze everything except one part, can I follow that part without guessing? These questions do not sound impressive, but they are effective because they stay close to what can be checked. Over time, this approach changes how you relate to knowledge itself. You become less impressed by explanations that arrive fully formed and more interested in how they survive testing. You stop asking whether an idea sounds right and start asking whether it continues to work when conditions change. Confusion becomes a regular visitor, but it no longer feels like a threat. It feels like a signal that something real is happening. This does not make thinking easier. It makes it slower and more careful, but it also makes it sturdier. Each piece of understanding you build this way is harder to knock down because it is connected to observed behavior, not just words. And when it does fail, it fails cleanly, showing you exactly where to look next. That is the quiet power of confusion. It keeps your thinking anchored to reality, even when certainty would be more comfortable. At this point, it becomes useful to say what confusion is not, because many mistakes happen here. Confusion is not the same as being overwhelmed. Overwhelm comes from too many moving parts at once. Confusion comes from one specific break in expectation. When everything feels confusing at the same time, that usually means the question is badly framed. Nothing clear can be tested, so nothing clear can fail. The task then is not to think harder, but to narrow the situation until one expectation can be isolated. This narrowing is an active process. You decide what you will temporarily ignore. You decide which detail does not matter yet. This is not cheating. It is how understanding becomes possible at all. No one understands a complex system by holding the whole thing in their head at once. They understand it by finding places where small changes produce visible effects. Confusion helps locate those places because it marks where your internal picture stops matching what you observe or calculate. Another common error is to think confusion means ignorance. That is not accurate. Ignorance is simply the absence of information. Confusion requires information. You must already know something for it to fail. A child who has never seen a certain phenomenon is not confused by it. Confusion appears only after a model has been formed and then exposed as incomplete. In that sense, confusion is evidence of prior learning, not the lack of it. This also explains why confusion tends to increase as people become more serious about a subject. Beginners often feel confident because they are repeating simple rules in simple situations. As soon as they try to extend those rules, the cracks appear. The system no longer behaves as expected. More details matter. More assumptions are revealed. Confusion grows, not because understanding has decreased, but because it is being tested more honestly. There is a temptation at this stage to retreat into general statements, to say things like it's complicated or there are many factors. These statements are not false, but they are unhelpful. They do not tell you which factor matters here. They do not tell you what would happen if one thing changed while everything else stayed the same. Used too early, they stop inquiry instead of guiding it. A more productive response is to ask what must be true for your expectation to have failed. Not what might be true in general, but what must be true in this specific case. This question has a useful property. It limits the range of possible answers. Some explanations are simply incompatible with what you observed. Others remain possible. Confusion shrinks as the impossible options are removed, not as comforting stories are added. It is worth emphasizing that this process has no final resting point. There is no moment where confusion disappears forever. Each new level of understanding creates new expectations, and each new expectation can fail. This is not a flaw in thinking. It is the mechanism by which thinking stays connected to reality. A mind that never feels confused is not deeply accurate. It is insulated. So the power of confusion does not come from the feeling itself. The feeling is usually unpleasant. The power comes from what it forces you to do if you take it seriously. It forces you to abandon vague certainty. It forces you to specify what you actually know. It forces you to confront the difference between words that sound right and ideas that work. In that sense, confusion is not an obstacle on the path to understanding. It is the path traced precisely at the points where understanding is still unfinished. If confusion is handled correctly, it changes how questions themselves are formed. Early on, questions tend to be vague. People ask things like, "Why does this happen?" or "What is really going on?" These questions feel deep, but they are too large to test. They allow almost any answer to sound reasonable. Confusion becomes productive only when it forces questions to shrink. A useful question has a clear failure condition. You should be able to say what kind of answer would be wrong. If no answer could possibly fail, then the question is not yet about understanding. It is about comfort. Confusion helps refine questions because it highlights where certainty breaks down. That break tells you which part of your thinking needs attention. Notice how this contrasts with how explanations are usually consumed. Many explanations are designed to flow smoothly from start to finish. They avoid pauses. They avoid friction. They leave the listener feeling satisfied but unchanged. Nothing in the explanation forces a prediction. Nothing demands that you risk being wrong. Confusion does the opposite. It interrupts the flow. It creates a pause where something must be checked. This pause is where discipline matters most. Without discipline, the pause gets filled with authority. Someone says, experts say, or science tells us, or it's been proven. These phrases end confusion without resolving it. They replace a broken expectation with a borrowed one. The mind feels relief, but the structure underneath remains weak. Using confusion correctly means resisting that relief. It means staying close to the exact point of failure and refusing to move on until something concrete can be said. Not something impressive, something specific. For example, if I change this one condition, will the outcome still occur? If I remove this assumption, does the explanation collapse? These are not philosophical questions. They are practical ones. Another important habit is learning to separate what you can vary from what you must hold fixed. Confusion often feels overwhelming because too many variables are changing at once. You think about the system, the context, the history, and the exceptions all at the same time. Nothing can be tracked. Understanding requires freezing most of the picture so one movement can be followed. This is not distortion. It is controlled observation. Misusing confusion usually takes one of two forms. The first is panic. People interpret confusion as a signal to stop. They abandon the question entirely or decide it is not for them. This wastes information. The confusion was telling them exactly where growth could occur. The second misuse is romanticizing confusion, treating it as depth in itself. Feeling confused does not mean you are thinking well. It only means something broke. What matters is what you do next. There is also a social pressure involved. Admitting confusion can feel risky. It exposes uncertainty. But hiding confusion has a cost. When people pretend to understand, conversations drift toward names, trends, and opinions instead of mechanisms. Everyone sounds informed. Very little is clarified. Quiet confusion accumulates beneath the surface, unresolved and unexamined. A thinker who values understanding learns to tolerate this social discomfort. They ask questions that slow the conversation down. They admit when something does not add up, not dramatically, calmly. This changes the tone. It invites precision. It shifts attention from performance to substance. Over time, this approach reshapes confidence itself. Confidence stops coming from having answers ready. It comes from knowing how to respond when answers fail. You trust that confusion will show you where to work, not where to quit. That trust is not emotional. It is earned through repeated contact with reality. So confusion, used properly, is not chaos. It is structure, revealing itself. It outlines the limits of your current understanding with surprising accuracy. Each boundary it exposes is an opportunity to replace vague certainty with something more reliable. Not something final, just something that works better than before. As this way of thinking settles in, one last shift becomes clear. Progress does not come from eliminating confusion, but from learning how to approach it repeatedly without distortion. People often imagine that experts feel less confused than everyone else. In practice, the opposite is closer to the truth. Experts feel confusion more precisely. They notice it earlier, and they take it more seriously. This is because experience sharpens expectations. When you have tested many ideas against reality, your predictions become more detailed. And the more detailed a prediction is, the more ways it can fail. A small mismatch stands out immediately. What a beginner might overlook as noise, an expert recognizes as a signal. Confusion appears quickly, not because the expert knows less, but because they are less tolerant of vague thinking. This also explains why genuine expertise often sounds hesitant. You hear pauses, you hear qualifications, not because the person is unsure of everything, but because they know exactly where certainty ends. They avoid making claims that cannot survive contact with changing conditions. This restraint is not weakness. It is respect for how easily explanations can outrun what is actually known. There is an important discipline here. When confusion arises, the expert does not rush to close it. They try to make it smaller. They ask what part of the picture is still reliable and what part is not. They keep what works and discard what does not. This selective process is how understanding grows without collapsing under its own weight. So the role of confusion at higher levels is not dramatic. It is routine. It is part of the maintenance of accurate thinking. It prevents knowledge from hardening into doctrine. It keeps ideas flexible enough to adapt when conditions change. And it ensures that understanding remains tied to behavior and outcomes, not to how convincing an explanation sounds. With this in place, we can now step back and clearly state what this approach gives us, what it does not, and what questions remain open. At the end of all this, it helps to be clear about what has actually been established and what has not. We have not discovered a special mental trick or a guaranteed method for reaching truth. What we have identified is a reliable way to stay aligned with reality while thinking. That alignment depends on treating confusion as information, not as a verdict on ability. What is known is simple and practical. When you understand something, you can track how it behaves under change. You can say what will likely happen next, and you can explain where that expectation might fail. When you cannot do this, confusion appears. That appearance is not a personal flaw. It is a signal that your current explanation has reached its limit. Used correctly, that signal points directly to where work is needed. What works again and again is staying close to what can be checked, narrowing questions, isolating assumptions, refusing to settle for words that feel complete but do not survive variation. This approach does not depend on intelligence, talent, or confidence. It depends on patience and honesty. It rewards attention, not speed. What remains unanswered is how far understanding can go, especially in systems with many interacting parts. There are limits imposed by complexity, by incomplete information, and by the sheer cost of testing every possibility. Confusion does not eliminate these limits. It only prevents us from pretending they are not there. That honesty matters. So the power of confusion is not that it feels enlightening. Often it feels frustrating and slow. Its power is that it keeps thinking grounded. It prevents borrowed certainty from replacing tested knowledge. It reminds you, quietly but firmly, that understanding is not something you claim. It is something you demonstrate each time you face a situation where your expectations might fail and choose to look carefully instead of looking away.